going to have a plenary session on flood and stormwater mitigation. Interesting topic, especially today. I'm sure we all experienced our own floodwater issues as we were driving here to the Dusit Hotel. And to lead us off and to be our facilitator, I am very proud to introduce Senator Sabina Flores Perez, a member of the 37th Guam Legislature. She serves as the Majority Whip and Chairperson for the Committee on Environment, Revenue and Taxation, Labor, Procurement and Statistics, Research and Planning. Senator Perez has provided a critical voice for change to increase effectiveness and responsiveness in government, protecting the public interest and creating a strong network of community leaders in a shared vision of a sustainable, thriving, and compassionate island family. So as she comes up, we'd also like to call to the stage Captain Brian Bearden again, Vanjie Lujan, if you could join us again. And we'd like to also welcome up the Director of Land Management, Joseph Borja, the Director of the Department of Public Works, Vince Areola, and our State Hazard Mitigation Officer and Homeland Security, Ronald Obispo. Please come up and join us at the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Sabina Perez.
This is Masi Ginger for that wonderful introduction. Again, I want to thank BSP for organizing this. I know how much work goes into organizing such an event like this, but I think it's very much worth it because I think planning is what's really needed for our community if we are going to move forward in creating sustainable societies. So just to introduce the panelists, some of them are obviously have been doing double duty today. So to my left is Ronald Obispo. He's the State Hazard Mitigation Officer of the Guam Homeland Security, FEMA Region 9. And part of his mission is to reduce the risk to people and property from natural hazards by developing and implementing long-term mitigation measures that will reduce or eliminate the severe effects of future disasters. Through hazard mitigation planning, we can reduce the loss of life and property by minimizing the impact of disasters. It begins by identifying natural disaster risks and vulnerabilities that are common in our area. After identifying these risks, we can develop long-term strategies to break the cycle of disaster damage and reconstruction. The next person over probably needs no reintroduction, but I've had the pleasure of working with Captain Brian Bearden. He works for Guam EPA, or he's assigned to Guam EPA. He's a chief engineer where he oversees Guam EPA's water division. And he's been instrumental to really updating a lot of the regulations that are outdated, that have been in the books for decades. And through his work, we were able to update the Safe Drinking Water Act and make it aligned with the US national standards so that we can regain primacy. So that's really key, but I know he has a lot of work. He's putting a lot of work into updating a lot of the EPA's regulations. And to his left is somebody we all know, Vanjie Lujan. She wears many hats in the community, and right now she's GWA's senior regulatory analyst. And so she helps to ensure that GWA is following the proper regulations, which is so critical. So she's also the chair of the Governor of Guam's Climate Change and Resiliency Commission and the co-chair for the Governor's Guam Green Growth Initiative. Vanjie is also appointed by the governor as a focal point for the Micronesia Challenge for Guam. And she started her career in government service as the Geographic Information System Manager at the Bureau of Statistics and Plans and was administrator for the Guam Coastal Management Program. To her left is Director Vince Areola from Department of Public Works. And he's another very, very important cabinet member here. He's done a lot of work. Obviously, you see the effects of his work with the paving of the roads, and he's just getting a lot of projects done. If you speak to him, he's just busy. He just completely has a lot of projects, probably doing one right now in his head. The next one over is Director Joe Borja, and he's an amazing person. He has institutional knowledge about land on Guam, and I just wish we could just download whatever's in his brain. Because what he has is so critical as far as land. I think it's a specialty that we need to definitely get our people to learn more about. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is just recap. So when I was asked to be a facilitator, we wanted to do something a little different, and there was a lot of work that was done in regards to identifying the gaps and what are some of the policy options. And so we didn't want to rehash that, but in this case, for the background, I do want to just kind of go over some of the discussion that we had in the past two assemblies. So again, I think this is a good segue into what was discussed earlier, and I'm always a big proponent of holistic planning, and I just want to kind of talk about what indigenous people have done, specifically Hawaiians, and their concept of ahupa'a, which is the way that they manage the land, a watershed that is. And so they were able to live harmoniously with their environment and be able to sustain themselves. So they protected the land as well as sustain themselves simultaneously. And so that idea, I would like to hopefully incorporate that into the way we manage our resources, looking at things in watersheds, in terms of watersheds. And so, next slide, please. And so in Guam, Guam is kind of like two islands put together. You have the northern part of Guam, which is predominantly limestone, and so a lot of the water is designed to infiltrate and become groundwater. And then, so what you see here is, in the middle is Weary's map of the different sub-basins, so you can imagine them as underground watersheds. The purple one that you see is the largest of the sub-basins, is the Jigo-Tuman Trough, and that's, the top of that is Mount Santa Rosa. So imagine all of Dedido, a big part of Dedido, Jigo, drains out into Tuman Bay. And so that also includes Barragata and I think parts of Manilao. So everything that we do above ground can eventually drain into the Tuman Bay area. And this is where we have most of our water wells. There's about 115 water wells, and a large number of them are over this area, in the area in colored purple. And so it's very important to think about which watershed do we live in and how that impacts the water resources, whether it's our drinking water or whether it's the marine environment. Next slide. And so this is just another picture of a specific watershed, and the one that we're in right now, which is part of the Jigo-Tuman Trough. And this is part of what we see, what's happening in this watershed, right, in the lower end of the watershed. Next slide. And so the other part of Guam is southern Guam, and it's like another island altogether if you look at it geologically. And this one is primarily clay soil, and that means the water has a hard time infiltrating. It's definitely more of a surface water. You see more surface water, and that's where our rivers are generally located. And this is basically the stereotypical type of watershed that we see. And these are all the colored areas are the different watersheds that Weary has identified. Okay, next slide. And so one of the ecosystems within this southern part of Guam is the ravine forests. Next slide. And so some of the issues that we're seeing is the overgrowth of a non-native species, which are the bamboos that causes flooding in that particular watershed. Next slide. And so at this point, I just want to kind of rehash some of the agency roles. And if we can get, I know there's some bullet points up there, and that was taken from the previous meetings that we had. But perhaps maybe I can have the different panelists talk about what the roles are in pertaining to flood prevention. So maybe I'll just go by order of who's closest to me. So Ronald, if you could maybe discuss what the agency's role, at least, or maybe your role in addressing flooding.
Actually, I want to thank you. You actually read my whole mission for me already. But for hazard mitigation under Homeland Security and Civil Defense, we try to identify the severeness of the different floodings all over the island. And more so now, we actually go to those areas and assess them and see what type of projects or strategies we could do to try to avoid it. The one thing that we don't want to do anymore is just do a quick fix. So understanding what the flooding issues are, the causes of the flooding, and then we move forward with most of them are mayors, getting ideas from even DPW or some of the strategies that we currently have to try to mitigate those floodings. So that's our mission in regards to flooding.
Great, great. So I have follow-up questions, but we'll follow along, go down with the panel. So the next one we have Brian Bearden.
Yeah, Guam EPA, we get called on a lot as one of the flood control agencies when floods occur, and you know, we always emphasize that we're not a flood control agency, but what we do have in our regulations is the requirement for all new development to put in on-site stormwater disposal systems. And those do go up to the 25-year, 24-hour storm. And so that is an important role that we have in the mitigation of future flood problems. But it's important to know that that is only during the permitting and construction of new facilities. Nothing in our regulations makes it retroactive to previously developed properties. But when people do come in for what we call a redevelopment, if they have to come in for a building permit, then depending on the scale of that redevelopment, we will require them to put in at least partial system onto their property. But that's our main role, and I think oftentimes we are confused as for the agency that responds when floods occur and takes action.
Okay, Vanjie.
GWA does not have any authority over stormwater, but we are a recipient of a lot of stormwater into our system. On Guam, we do not have a combined system. Our wastewater is strictly a wastewater system, but through aging infrastructure and areas where people open up their clean out and they allow their property to drain within our system, we end up with a thing called sanitary sewer overflows, which is when the sewer system through the manhole, you see it sometimes bubbling. That's sewer. So please stay out of it. And it's caused by, a lot of it, of our system is caused from flooding during heavy rainstorms.
Thank you, Senator. At DPW, we are, I believe we've got like 3 roles. The first one, of course, is permitting. We make sure that in all our permitting activities that flooding issues or potential flooding issues are addressed. And then, of course, we have our current maintenance program to make sure that flooding remains controlled as much as possible. But, you know, truth be told, we are playing catch up. We've had flooding issues for the last 40 years that just for some reason, either the folks that be or folks at whether they be at DPW or EPA, and the residents just kind of like put up with it, right? And so we've had these for the last 30, 40 years. And so we've been addressing them. And I can talk a little about that later. And then the third part, of course, is enforcement. That if there are any major flooding issues that are caused by humans, by development, by commercial activities, you know, we work with the EPA, as Captain Brian had talked about, to address those issues.
Thank you, Director. Director Joe Borja.
Thank you, Vince. I think you guys may have used up all my lines here. The Department of Land Management statutes and regulations focus on land use. Through the subdivision and parceling process, general requirements for subdivision are to provide for sufficient drainage of the land to provide reasonable protection against flooding. In a Guam Land Use Commission approved subdivision, storm drainage facilities shall be provided in all subdivisions in accordance with plan preparation by the subdivider, conforming to criteria established by the Commission in the subdivision law. These facilities shall be designed to dispose of normal storm water falling on the subdivision without hazard of flooding, inconvenience of ponding, and the erosion of public or private lands. So that's where we don't really deal at land management per se with flooding. It's through the Land Use Commission that we impose some of these restrictions. And as Commander or Captain Bearden said, these are progressive going forward. We can't enforce backwards. And of course, the enforcement of the zoning law is DPW, building official. So that's the part that we play on here.
Okay, thank you for those introductions about your roles. So next slide, please. And so these are some of the major gaps. I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting, but these are some of the highlights from the previous assemblies. So one of the things that was brought up is that the subdivision, basically it pertains to developments that are six residences or more. And so there's much stricter requirements, as Director Borja was talking about, that they have to ensure that there's drainage infrastructure for those types of developments. But when it comes to developments that are under 6 homes, there is less oversight, from what I understand. They do review the plan, but they don't require, there's no requirement for any kind of drainage infrastructure. And then, so there's that, the piecemealing of development can lead to these cumulative effects. And then the other thing was post-construction regulations. There's nothing in law that requires any type of installation to address flooding issues. And basically a lot of the work is the front end, so the permitting, they have to review the plans, ensure that the construction is following those plans. But when it comes time to the actual functioning of those developments, there's nothing in law that would hold the owner of that property should there be flooding issues. And then as of now, there's no lead agency. So like you heard, Director Borja oversees the plans for the land use plan, or at least ensure the zoning law, it complies with zoning laws. But as far as enforcement, it's DPW. So there's no one agency that really controls that. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this as far as some of the major gaps? I caught them pretty much. Okay. Brian.
Yeah, just one other big gap, and that's especially for the subdivisions and the ones that fall under the threshold and the piecemeal development, is that the Guam EPA regulations have always had held an exemption for the development of a single family's home, and that's always been implemented. So there's never been historically a requirement that these single homes, as they get developed one by one, to put in any kind of a stormwater control system. And I think that's one of the big leading contributors to this cumulative impact that we see out there. So that's one of the other big gaps.
Thank you for that. Anything else? Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the flood prevention options. And so there's a whole bunch. And again, you know, a lot of these are maybe difficult to implement, but there are many things to choose from. So changes to the review process is one, where there is one suggestion where they can look at the maps. So in addition to looking at the paper maps, because I remember that they said the pretty pictures, right? You can look at the pretty pictures, but how does it really function on the site? So maybe having a dual review where you have a Department of Land Management look at the maps, and then Department of Public Works looks at the site and does the actual percolation tests, and they look at the topography on site to kind of identify where the problem areas might be. So using that information. The other thing is the incentivizing low impact development. So green infrastructure, a lot of that was talked about earlier in the previous panel. So incentivizing those types of things where it reduces the amount of impervious areas, which can lead to flooding. And that's where, development by design will lead to, you're compacting the land. So that water that's hitting the earth is going to flow rather than infiltrate. So, the smaller the footprint, maybe the better it would be. So the other thing is design standards for fences. So there's no design standard currently, but maybe we can update those standards. We could talk to Brent maybe in regards to allowing flow through rather than just a massive water, massive movement of water. There's many different ideas and designs that can be done to help mitigate flooding. And of course, policy changes. A lot of this would require policy changes. So designating a lead flood control agency, changing rules to include retroactive installation, and then funding, how are we going to get the funding? And one of the ideas is creating a utility, stormwater utility with funding mechanism. So these are not necessarily easy things to accomplish, but these are options. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what we're going to do now is more of a application. And so we put together we identified 2 sites, one in the north and one in the south. And being that we have a very esteemed panel here and a very knowledgeable panel, I would like to hopefully get their input as, you know, what each agency can do to address these flooding issues. And so I did provide some questions in advance for them to think about. So the two sites that we chose, the north is in Barragata, so it's at Leon Guerrero Street in Barragata. And so we'll talk about that one first, and maybe we can have Director Borja kind of characterize the site, and then we can have input from all the panelists to see how should we troubleshoot this flooding, this area that has flooding. Director Borja. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Senator. Are we going to start on the sites? Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So this is the larger map. Just to kind of give you a bearing, sorry, excuse me. So yeah, this is I don't know if you can identify where this is in Barragata, but you see that towards the top, there's the Untalan Middle School, right? So you'll, yeah, it's Untalan Middle School, but we're gonna focus on the highlighted area. So that's where the flooding occurs. So next slide. Oh, sorry, this should have been first, but yeah, this kind of gives you a bearing. So there's Wendy's, and that's the area down there. Next slide. And so now we're zooming in that area. So, sorry, Director, if you don't mind kind of characterizing the site.
Okay, I do have some graphics there, AV guys, if you can show it up, Leon Guerrero folder. Take a look at 2021 Leon Guerrero Street. And as the Senator said, this is the area in Lejang. And, let me get my graphics up here. (2021) Leon Guerrero Street. There we go. So that's Leon Guerrero Street. Well, it left. First off, in this presentation, if I could have a little bit more of your time, isn't it a great day for a flooding symposium? And Ed, I'm not going to take roll call this afternoon, right, after lunch. But thank you for your time, though, for returning. This is Leon Guerrero Street in Lejang. Okay, yeah, leave it there for a few minutes. See the V on the bottom? That's Leon Guerrero Street heading up. And it goes up, and you make a right-hand turn, and you go all the way in. And it curves up to a house there on top, and then a house further in with the nice big green lawn. Well, between those two houses, you see that green hole there in the middle? That's actually a hole. I mean, it's 30 feet deep and about 60 to 90 feet wide. And that's in the area. Flooding occurs in the whole area. Some of it is mitigated by that hole. Can we go back to the 1994? Take a look at the size of that hole and the development around that. Now, can we go back to, okay, this is the 1994 photograph of that area. And that area didn't flood in 1994 because there were less houses in the area, and they had that big, huge hole there. So that hole today shrunk, guess down to about maybe 20%, 25% of its original size. But that's how Leon Guerrero Street and that area looked in 1994. And take a look at down on the bottom left on the V, if we could go back to the 2018 photograph. 2018. Just go back to your list and look for 2018. Okay, that's good. These are the lot lines and the topo lines. And here you can see that hole, that ponding basin, whatever it is, a collection area for water. You can see it on that one lot. It's a private lot. But if you remember the 1994 photograph, and you take a look at that V area down in the bottom, you see now 2 new houses on that left-hand side of Leon Guerrero Street. And also next to it, you see a 50-foot easement. But the easement seems a little bit misaligned. And then if you follow that easement going up, you see that the easement on top goes across a roof. That's where the easement to that property. But this project started out by one of the landowners in the bottom right-hand corner, if you can see the hammerhead, wanting to get access to her property, legal access, and asked DPW to come in to open up the road. Well, it wasn't that easy really to open up a road because first place, Legend Road is misaligned, the Leon Guerrero Street is misaligned, and as it goes around the corner there, it seems to cut through a garage made on the property. And then, of course, it goes in and eventually, hopefully, ends up at that hammerhead. But those 4 properties in the middle there, lot 1090-2-1 and 1090-2-3, those are government properties now that the government of Guam exchanged in order to expand that ponding basin so that flooding can be taken care of in the area. The exact lot where that ponding basin is, that round muddy water there, that actually belongs to a private property owner, and so does the property below it. Years ago, Gov Guam and the municipality of Barrigada, through the mayor, tried to condemn the whole area to turn it into a ponding basin so that all the water can be directed into that property. The house to the left with the nice white roof was recently built in, I believe, between 2006 and 2010. And before they built that house, they knew that that area was flood prone. So what did they do? They built up the property. And of course, the water went through the other low area right next to it and naturally flowed over towards the ponding basin. So the water flow goes through that one lot there and on lot 101-R2, and it's endangering the foundation of that house in there. And then you see the front property there where the entrance is to Leon Guerrero Street, that the street actually goes through private property. And if we can go to a 2018, another 2018 shot. Okay, again, you can see that area without the property lines. And go ahead and work backwards now. 2018 to the next. And then 2060 with the topo. That kind of shows the topography of the area. But also interestingly, across the street there where there are nice colored things, those are called wetlands. That's Lake Barrigada over on that side. And of course, that's on the other side of the road. So the water flows from Route 10, it flows west. It doesn't go to the other side where there's a natural lake, I guess, in that area. So let's go behind 2016. What's the next one before that? Okay, and this is in 2010. And as you can see in the 2010, this is the first photograph that I was able to find that showed the construction of that new house there, right by the V of entrance to Leon Guerrero Street. But as you can see further inland, further in that street, the ponding basin is now covered up with grass and whatever, and may have turned into a wetlands now. So let's see the one in 2004 or 2006. That's where the house is not there yet. It wasn't built until after 2006. But you can see that the owner of that property has begun to lay some coral, aggregate, whatever, to bring up the level of that property because he knows already from previous experience that that lot actually floods and holds the water and doesn't cross Leon Guerrero Street to go to the other side.
Okay, so Director Borjas, so in your position as in land management, If the owner were going to build the house, prior to building the house, you would have missed this, right? Because it's not in the regulations.
It's not in
it's
the
really-
regulation, and as Captain Bearden said, you know, for these single homes that are built, there's really no regulation on it. However, sometimes when you build on your own property, using it for what you want, you could inadvertently cause flooding to the adjoining lots, even if you're just building, you know, one house, as the case may be here.
Thank you. And so Director Arreola, being the agency that oversees, has the enforcement capability, is there anything that your agency can do to address the situation?
I think Captain Bearden brought it up. Typically, we have the subdivision rules, right? That's 6 or more houses. I think we're at that stage where my personal thing is every house that gets built on Guam has to contain their water. Because what's happening is in certain areas, especially throughout Barrigada, Barrigada is probably the worst place in terms of topography. All kinds of flood area. It could be a short-term flood. It'll flood for about 6 or 7 inches, and it's gone in about 2 hours. Or otherwise, you could have a flood, and it'll last for 2 days. Just depends on the area in Barrigada. But on my desk, I can tell you right now, I probably have like about 20 areas that flood just in Barrigada. And so what happens is a house gets built, and they're a little bit okay. Then another house gets built, they're okay. By the time you start getting to house number 3, 4, 5, especially if they're in a cul-de-sac or if they're in a low-lying area, all of a sudden the water starts puddling outside their home or alongside the road. And once they see flooding start to creep up, they start to build fences, concrete fences, to keep the water out of their property. But the water still comes. And then all of a sudden, you're going to have like a cul-de-sac or a portion of the road that may be depressed, and all of a sudden, you have major flooding. But it wasn't treated as a subdivision. No one was required to put a ponding basin. You just had the normal effects of development and single home construction. So a lot of that is happening all throughout the island. When it comes to addressing flooding, the first thing we look for is seeing if we can tie it into an existing stormwater system. We're doing that right now at Westbrook Road in Barrigada. That's pretty much across the Antalan School there. That had flooding at maybe, let's call it 50%, right? Well, a homeowner built his home there, saw the flooding, and just put up a concrete wall. That flooding doubled overnight. And so what we're left to do is there's flooding in the road, probably at a foot today that we saw. And so good part is there's a stormwater drainage system about 60, 70 feet away. We're going to be able to tie that in. But if there's no stormwater drain, our next plan is I start calling Joe. Joe, I need some government property to put perhaps an infiltration system in there, perhaps a ponding basin on the side of the road. So those are the options that we have right now. But you can't just put in an infiltration chamber system in one day. There's a lot of regulatory issues that we got to deal with. There's a lot of utility issues we got to deal with, and ownership issues right away, things of that nature. So it's difficult. We certainly see the results of development throughout the island. Most especially in Barrigada, Mongmong, some in Tumon as well, and at Tumuning.
So you also implement a stormwater manual. So my understanding, there's 2 stormwater manuals, one that DPW enforces and one that Guam EP enforces. Is that correct? So what's it within your purview how would you basically address this problem using the tools and the authorities that you have? Is there something that you can do to address this?
Well, enforcement-wise and addressing it wise, we do have the MS4 permit program that we're currently under. For those of you who don't know, MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Stormwater Sewer System. Yeah. And so we just got permitted by US EPA about 2 years ago. It's an 8-year permit, but we are required, in a nutshell, to ensure that all stormwater that gets drained into our oceans is as clean as possible. Very basic. So that includes all the stormwater drains along Marine Drive, along all the major routes. The stormwater coming off the rivers that go into our oceans have to be as clean as possible. So that's a lot of work. It's identifying our assets, which are the stormwater drains. It's cleaning out those assets. It's having a maintenance program, and it's making sure that what goes into those stormwater drains is basically stormwater. You can't have grass clippings, plastic bottles, industrial solvents, oils, things of that nature. So it's a long comprehensive plan that we're in charge of.
And so who monitors that? Is it US EPA or Guam EPA does the monitoring of that?
Some of it, I believe US EPA, our local EPA will assist us with the testing, but the responsibility is on DPW. The permit is with DPW.
Okay. So again, what would you do to address the flooding issue here? Is there something specifically that you can do as an agency with this?
Well, you know, like I mentioned, a lot of these floods have been here for 40 years, right? The way to address it is, you know, as I mentioned, we have to take, the water is going to go where it wants to go. So we have to take that water, those flood waters, to either a ponding basin, an infiltration chamber system, existing stormwater system, and that's really all we can do. If we're thinking of pumping water every time it floods, we'll be there all day. So it's a matter of looking at where the flood areas are, finding out where there are government properties. If there are no government properties, it might involve land taking to put in a system to catch the water and dispose of the water, as Joe had mentioned in one of the properties right there. And so, you know, there's usually like 4 or 5 options to address the stormwater system.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, hold on, Joe. I just want to make sure I get all the panelists in. Vanjie, so any input or insight into addressing this issue?
I think that we had mentioned this in the previous workshop, the previous session about watershed management. And this is an example of utilizing watershed management to control water and erosion. So I think that it's time that we start looking at, as Mr. Barr had mentioned and Vince had mentioned, each individual landowner has to be responsible for the water on their property. And so I just would like to put a plug in for the School of Engineering, the University of Guam. They are really trying to have their engineers more, have the tools to develop using low impact design. And so that's something that they're looking at in terms of using bioswales, vegetative buffers, other things. I mean, it just really depends how much water is here to what type of a system. But I think that looking at a cumulative effect when individual homes are going to be built, and then also trying to utilize low impact designs, permeable pavement, other things that will allow the water to go down into the aquifer versus being spread out on surfaces instead.
Thank you, Vanjie. Brian, do you have any insights on solving this issue?
Yeah, well, this is a great example because you picked the hardest to solve type of situation that we have on Guam, where the development has occurred already. Guam EPA can't go back in, as far as we know, we can't go back in and force people to retroactively install stuff. What we should be doing is looking forward and trying to get this problem, prevent it from happening in the first place. And there's some real structural problems with the way individual home construction is accomplished here in Guam. And I'm going to list out a few of those right now, because I think that'll help lead us towards some of the solutions. One of those is that it comes in one piece at a time, and the reviewers at both DPW and Guam EPA, they see, the drawing they see shows, if they're lucky, only the topography of the lot in question. It doesn't show the surrounding area. So unless you've done your research or you happen to know the history of these neighborhoods, those plan reviewers, engineer or not, are not going to catch this problem. And so that leads to the question of who's responsible then for catching this problem. You know, should it be the government? There is an answer for that, and the answer is that the person who designed that house, who put their stamp on that plan, be it an architect or an engineer, they are responsible for that entire drawing. They're paid to do it. They're supposed to be on that site. They're supposed to do that research and find out where the water flows. and it's not happening. And one of the reasons that I believe is not happening, and we touched on this in the last session, is we've been keeping very careful records at Guam EPA for the last 3 years and analyzing those statistically. And what we've noticed is that about 60+% of all the single-family home permits that come through our office are stamped by just 4 or maybe 5 engineers and architects. And looking at the other engineers and architects that stamp about 95% of them, we know who they are, and we know that they're all moonlighters, is what they're called, right? They're stamping plans as a side business. They might have a full-time job with the government somewhere else. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That can be done in a responsible fashion, but we see people, as I mentioned in the last session, that are stamping over 100 plans, 100 permits a year, and others that are within that top 5. It goes from 50-something up to 100. There's no way that these particular engineers and architects are able to do the amount of work that they should be doing. And as a government, one of the things that we do to protect the public from these types of problems is we license engineers and architects, and that license proves that that engineer and architect is qualified. They have the education, they have the experience, they've passed a test. There's 3 tests, 3 basic qualifications they have to meet to get licensed. Our staff know. They talk to the people that design these homes. The people that are actually doing these designs are not the engineers that are stamping them. They're drafters, they're designers, they're contractors. They're the ones who come into our office to make these small corrections from our side. So we have this problem from the very top to the bottom of the construction industry in Guam. And it's, we could revoke the license of those 5 engineers, but there would be another 5 engineers that would take their place because the market is leading toward that. People want cheap engineering. These guys are doing it for a fraction of the cost of a real engineering firm. And so the contractors are going to continue going for that. So we have to do something about the industry to force them to follow the rest of our laws that deal with development and to honor the professional licensing of the architects and engineers on the island. And Banji, I'm glad you brought up the School of Engineering. We're pumping out all these engineer graduates. What market, what business are they going to have if 60% of that business is taken up by a handful of, frankly, unethical engineers? So kind of a long answer to your question, but to get back to the point here, if that was being done correctly, and if the architect and engineer was looking at each one of those lots and driving out to that site, doing some basic research, talking to the neighbors, are there flooding problems in this neighborhood? At the very least, they could warn that person that's building that, hey, you're in the low spot here, that house gets flooded, and I can't responsibly build a wall around that or I'll flood your neighbors, and then they can start looking for other options. But we do also have the other options that Vince mentioned. We could start requiring individual stormwater systems on every single lot, and just to make a correction of what was said earlier, there are requirements. Every single project in Guam is required to do that. It's just that there's exemptions in Guam EPA's regulations, which may be applied by the administrator. So the administrator could revoke those exemptions at any time. And when we have found situations where we know there's a problem, we have required those systems we put in. There's another neighborhood just, I think it's farther down this area, where we happen to know that there's a flooding problem because somebody spoke up to us. And we saw one person who was developing, I believe it was 5 lots in that area, and we required them to put in French drains, like a gravel pit, to try to take care of some of that runoff. And that person went and tried to sell some of those lots and come back and say, well, now it's less than 5 lots, I don't need to do this. And we held their feet to the fire and made them do that. So it can be done. We have the tools we need to do it. We just need the will to do it, and the industry needs to step up as well and start doing their part of it as well and not just put it all on the government.
Thank you, Brian. So Ronald, I know you were talking earlier about your role in actually troubleshooting these different flooding areas. And so one of the questions I had to you, but also I want your insight, is so do you address only flood map areas that are mapped to experience floods, or do you actually deal with these localized flooding issues as well?
We also do a lot of local. In fact, Barragata is on my top 3 list of different things I have to mitigate on, and it's very, very difficult. I agree. We need to cut this in the front. Right now, all we're doing is it's happening, and then we're trying to fix it, and we're going through DPW, who's trying to redirect the water towards drainage areas. One thing that we haven't talked about is as these houses are developed, and either they are flat roofs or angled roof, their roof wash-off it becomes very strong and pushes towards a certain area. So it goes in different directions. Unfortunately, the homeowners, when they develop their homes, and let's say they apply for a mortgage on this, one of the banks require for them to do a flooding assessment. And once they're told, yeah, you're in a flood zone, exactly right, the first thing they do is they lift it. Avoid all of that, but have no further thinking past their property line and what will happen. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 there, and here we are. My part is to try to fund the solutions to these floodings to avoid further floodings down the road, but it's hard. We can try to do a drainage or a few investments that we have to do, but in the long run, as these houses develop in close vicinity of each other, it'll continue to do so. So enforcement from the very beginning, like these fly-by-night architects or designers, make them accountable for it. And if the flooding occurs down the road, and it's founded that they were the ones who developed this house, make them still be accountable for it for the life of the house, basically. That's one way. I mean, force them. But who knows if they're even going to be in existence within 5 years after building the house. So.
Okay, so there's something already in law that we can do, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that.
Well, the other thing also is, take a look at our building codes and how we can include these guys and to affect these guys into that. We talked about enforcement on DPW side, and we understand, and we're actually looking at finding ways where we can help you, maybe even do some trainings for more enforcement officers or personnel, right? So we're actually in conversations with GCC on it, on that idea of doing that.
Okay, so I know we're running out of time, but I do want to get to the second case study. But really quickly, I know, Joe, you had a follow-up?
Yes, if the AV guys could put up 2018 Leon Guerrero Street lot owners slide picture, whatever you call it. In this particular case, there is a possible solution, which is basically creating a watershed in that area. And we're fortunate in that area that there was some previous work by Mayor June Blas in working to acquire 2 private lots in there, which Guam did. So there are 2 lots, 2018 Leon Guerrero Street lot owners. Yes, that one. So here it shows Lejang Road, Leon Guerrero Street, and then it shows the lot owners in that area. And 2 of them are Guam already has. The 2 other landowners there, Scambiluri, who owns the actual hole in the ground there, that belongs to an estate, so it's taking a little time to get that thing to a condition where it can be sold or acquired by the government. The lot below it is owned by Felix Babauta. Mr. Babauta has lived in the States for about, I think, 50 years. And he would like a land exchange in the area or to buy the lot from him. So both of those lots are technically on the market for government acquisition. If the government acquires those 4 lots, it could certainly develop a nice bonding basin, watershed area, and still provide the access road into the very last landowner there, the Villagomez family there. That's way in there. So in this particular case, there is a solution. But as you know, alienation and disposition of public lands or purchasing condemnation of private property needs legislative intervention, Senator.
Thank you for that. Vanjie?
I just wanted to mention that, or say that, similar to like water or sewer, I'm assuming there is no stormwater system in this area. And I think that we're not talking about that, but I think that that's probably the next thing that we really need to do is areas can't be developed unless there is stormwater. And the other thing that under our own authority, if there were stormwater and people are, sometimes you go up into Dededo and you'll see people have these grates in their houses. It's to drain the water, and then they illegally connect to our system. We can find that out, and we have a big hammer. We turn their water off, and you will see how fast they can figure out a solution for that.
All right, thank you. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on to the south. Next slide. And this is Finelli Creek, I believe, in Huggett. So, Director Barr, I don't know if you wanted to kind of characterize this site and the flooding in that area. In Huggett.
Yeah,
Do you have a solution already?
Finley Street area. And this is basically really up coastal zone management issue. If you could, AV guys, gentlemen, if you could put up the Finley Creek outfall. So this is the Finley Creek outfall, that beautiful fan you see up on the left-hand corner of the photograph. That's where the water from Finley Creek comes up, and I think that's under Edwin's jurisdiction. But in between the two red lines of that gray-green area in the middle there, there's a bunch of landowners, and they've come to land management asking what do they need to put up a retaining wall on the rear portion of their property abutting Finley Creek. I didn't have an answer for them. That's probably an Army Corps of Engineers issue. But my experience with trying to block a river or a creek by putting a retaining wall is good luck if it lasts, past the rainy season, because you're going to have to develop it all the way up and not just that one portion. And so you can channel the water that doesn't erode the river banks or the creek banks. But you also have to look at the end, where it's going to come out of. And that nice little fan area there, that's where the water comes out. And I think Edwin has a lot to say about that particular issue of draining the water from Finley Creek over there into the outfall. So that's really not per se a flooding issue, although in times of heavy rains and that the rains do tend to erode some of the property, the rear property boundary lines on it. And this lady came in and asked, she wanted to put up a retaining wall, but just on her portion of her property, and kind of told him to go ask Vince to put in that thing in there. And then after you see Vince, Captain Bearden would have something to say about that, and Edwin would probably have something to say at the end there. So that's a flooding problem also, but that's not just dealing with flooding on your property. It's where that water goes at the end there that has a big problem with developing a culvert or a system to drain that orderly, but still it's got to go out there by the coast.
So there's a lot of erosion that's happening in the outfall area?
There's a lot of erosion that's happening along the creek, all these property lines along the red street line there. There's a lot of erosion on there, and landowners, of course, want to protect their properties. But I don't know that putting a retaining wall right on your rear property line, it may solve your issue for a few months or till the next rainy season, but it certainly doesn't solve the overall issue of Finley Creek. I know that Army Corps of Engineers has done a study on that, but I'm not sure what came off of that study.
Thank you so much, Director.
I have.
Okay, great. Yeah,
actually, the good news is the guys at BSP and Coastal are actually looking at this and actually has a grant to do a feasible study for restoration of the deterioration of that creek. In doing so, it may slow down the flow of water and avoid that, but that homeowner also at the same time is encroaching into the actual path of of that river creek. So if it does put a retaining wall, all it's going to do is going to go left or right. And then the property owners on the left and the right will have that same question, if I can put a retaining wall. So, but it is in progress, sir. So we're going to try to resolve this issue. But it needs to go through a feasible study first.
Great, thank you for that. Brian, does Guam EPA look at this property, or have you seen this property already?
No, personally, this is the first I've heard of this property, so I don't know enough about it to say much. But other than just looking at the development that's come up around it, I'm assuming that there's no drainage system in that neighborhood to the side. So it's again a very similar kind of situation where all the cumulative development has impacted these unfortunate people that live near the bottom of that creek, and it's very difficult to deal with when you get to that point.
And so, but as far as Guam EPA, you would look at erosion controls
Well, Guam EPA's erosion control regulations, again, that they are written as construction regulations. So if someone's constructing, then the erosion control regulations apply. But we try to tell people try to come to us and say, hey, can't you do something about these off-roaders or whatever? And the regulations don't cover that. It doesn't say that anyone doing any activity in Guam cannot cause erosion. It just doesn't cover it.
And it doesn't cover fences too, right?
Well, construction, right? So if you're doing construction and it requires a building permit, then you have to look at that, and then we can start kicking in some of our requirements. And one of the requirements that is related to fences, in fact, is there is a requirement in the erosion control regulations that say that none of the construction or grading performed on a lot may cause any adverse impact to your neighbor's lot in terms of changing the flow of water or the deposition of silt. And so we've begun putting that in as a permit condition, and so that we do have a way to come in later in the future if they do cause these problems. But that was never put in as a permit condition before. And I think the interpretation of that is if the permit was issued, Guam EPA approved it. So that's a tough one. Again, you have to see it when it's happening. But at least now we're putting that in there as a permit condition.
Okay, thank you. Vanjie, do you have any insights into this project?
I just have a question, actually. So is it the same thing like septic tanks, that if you are in an area prone to flooding or within the downstream of areas that you will get flooded, the amount of property for you to build a house is different? Or do we have that in our regulation at all, where it manages knowing full well that we do have a rainy season and a dry season, that the lot size is for development is dependent on your maybe if you're going to be flooded or not? Is that something?
I don't think so, but I think Director Borja could, that's the zoning law, right?
I don't think there's any reference to usable land. You may have 1,000 square meters, but it may not all be usable. But I don't think there's any regulations or anything that says because you're next to a river creek that your setback has to be more. I know they have that in commercial properties abutting a residential property. You have your lot line, and then you also have another setback that you have to put 20 feet in, but that's because of the commercial activity there, not something like that. So definitely that can be looked at. Similar to the fact that if you build a house, you don't have to have a fire hydrant. I think that in the building permit process, building plans, if you're building a house, I think either you or the contractor should be required to provide a fire hydrant for that house, wherever it may be. We have some houses in Barrigada, 4 or 5 houses that don't have access to a fire hydrant, at least not less than 200 feet away. And they're asking, can the government put that in? But something like that can be put into the regulations, as well as the issue that Vanjie put up. It's maybe some of the planners and the realtors might not agree with that, but it does help prevent future problems, to future landowners. I've heard of houses in Barrigada that's been sold like 2 or 3 times for a cheap price. And why? Because it was flooding, and people scoop it up and buy it in the hopes of mitigating it or getting some land exchange from the government. But we already know that that area is prone to flooding, and some of those houses were bought with or built with federal funds. And as Commander Bearden said, or Ron said, only now do some banks require that there be a flooding report, attached to your construction plans.
Okay, thank you for that input. Director Ariola, is there anything you wanted to add to the?
I think it's several things. New homeowners who are looking to construct, they have to really be diligent in where they're looking to buy, where they're looking to build. My personal case, when I remember 20 years ago, I told my dad I'm buying a house in Barragata. First thing he said was, no, you're not buying a house in Barragata. He didn't even know where it was, just because he grew up in Barragata, so he knows the area. So sure, he came out and we looked at it, looked at the topography, you look at the hillsides, you look at talk to the neighbors, does it flood here? I think that kind of due diligence is really much needed. We've seen so many individuals today that are building homes in low-lying areas. They know they're going to get flooded. They know it, but and it could be just a function of economics, right? That's perhaps a property that was given to them by the family, it was deeded to them, or they bought it cheap or whatever. That's the property that they have. But you have to really understand what happens when we're in a tropical island. The rain is a fact of life, and you're going to have to deal with it one way or another. When Joe was talking about several homes I know myself, that they flip over 2, 3, 4 times. They're probably sold during the dry season when it's not flooded, and then 7, 8 months later it gets flooded and the person just moves out. So I think due diligence on the part of homeowners who are looking to construct or build, that has to really occur. They have to know exactly where they're buying and building.
I also think that we need to, because certain people cannot relocate, they can't retreat. That's the same situation we have with climate change and infrastructure. But maybe it's a new design. I know the traditional design for Old Chamorro homes is they're all elevated, right? They're elevated on stilts. And I know that in some jurisdictions, for areas prone to flooding, that's the design. You don't go back to what we see now, which is the house on the ground. And our own tradition is that the house was elevated. So I think maybe our architects can come up with nice, super cool designs elevated above to address, because what we don't want, one of the things about flooding is really allowing that water to go where it naturally goes. And maybe we just accept the fact that these areas are going to flood, but we can design it better to mitigate it, or to ensure that the property that we own is not going to erode away.
Okay, thank you. And I know we're almost out of time, but I just want to run through some questions so we can go to the next couple slides. And this could be a discussion as you mingle with the audience. So some of the questions that I asked, how do we address flooding in terms of climate change? Next slide. How can Guam move forward with proactive sustainable land use policies? And I think we discussed that earlier in the previous panel. And what funding sources are available to address flooding? So these are some questions that we can probably take offline and discuss further. But I do want to open up to the audience if there's any questions for the panelists here regarding flooding issues. But I do want to thank you for, we had these 2 case studies and you were able to actually solve the problem. So give them a hand. And I think this definitely shows that, interagency, this is something I really would like to see more of, is this interagency collaboration, and you could see it taking place. And so thank you so much. So any questions from the audience? Maybe we could take one question.
In previous conferences, we talked about a flooding czar. Somebody who would oversee everything and kind of group all the organizations and agencies together. Whatever happened to that concept?
Well, that was one of the recommendations, but yeah, I think.
Did we get stuck?
People designated probably DPW potentially.
I can tell you right now, that is a full-time job, especially where we are today.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned earlier, we're just playing catch up with 30, 40 years of flooding in various areas of the island. And it's not just roads, but it's rivers, it's creeks, it's homes, it's hillsides, things of that nature. Yeah, that's almost a full-time job, full-time division actually to take care of, and a lot of money, and a lot of policy change, as we've discussed over the last hour here. A lot of policy change.
Angie.
So I just want to tell Vince, if that's your job, you only have to worry about it 6 months out of the year. The rest of it, nobody's going to bother you when it's dry season. But I think that that we have an opportunity, I think, with the infrastructure bill and then the climate change bill that was just signed by the president today, right, or yesterday. And I know that everybody looks at the infrastructure in terms of water and power, but they're not necessarily, and solar panels, but maybe this is an opportunity for us to have this real conversation about putting stormwater in these highly prone residential areas where funding is very limited opportunities. And so I hope that Tyrone could probably cover this tomorrow if this is an opportunity to really beef up that infrastructure as climate change becomes more prevalent.
Right. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'm looking forward to the future conversations. So thank you so much. This ends our panel.
So we're going to have our last breakout sessions of the afternoon. And we unfortunately do not have Matt Geiger with us, mostly because we've been having tech issues being able to connect to him. So unfortunately, we will not have that breakout session available. So that means if you're looking at your program, we are going to have 2 breakout sessions. The first breakout session is going to be here in the Grand Ballroom, and that will be on the Guam Endangered Species Population and Abundance Update. It will be presented by Dr. G. Kurt Fielder, Professor of Biology at the University of Guam, and it will talk about tree snails, butterflies, terrestrial invertebrates, and the Endangered Species Act. So for those of you that are interested in that presentation, please remain in this room. It will be the last presentation of the day, so once he's done, he will go ahead and let you guys off, and I will see you all here tomorrow morning bright and early. The other session, which is going to occur at the same time, is going to be on federal agency activity, federally approved or funded activity, and what you need to know about obtaining federal consistency. It will be led by Julian Jansen from the Guam Coastal Management Program, and it will be held in the Royal Ballroom B, which is just outside the doors to the left. So we would like to ask you, if you could, those who want to attend the federal consistency breakout session, to please join us in Ballroom B. And then for those of you who are interested in the Guam Endangered Species Population and Abundance session, I will let you know that Dr. G. Kurt Fielder is a professor of biology from the University of Guam, and he is with the Division of Natural Sciences from the College of Natural and Applied Sciences. He joined UOG in 2012 after working in Japan for 11 years on research and teaching. So I will welcome up to this stage Dr. G. Kurt Fiedler.
Good afternoon. I'm not actually used to using a microphone, so when I mess up, please forgive me. Some of my students, former students, are here, and there's some folks I've worked with in the past here, and hopefully we'll give you some new information on things you don't know much about, and maybe some things you know a little bit about already. So I'm going to mostly talk about tree snails and butterflies because these are our big endangered species in most need of attention on Guam. Not that the birds aren't important, but we just don't have many birds. We still have invertebrates like tree snails and butterflies, and there are a lot of construction projects and a lot of development projects that impact them. A little bit about me. As a bio mentioned, I came here in 2012 after spending a little more than a decade in Japan. And since I came to University of Guam, I was hired onto several DoD projects for surveys and very quickly became one of the few people working with terrestrial invertebrates. Originally, I had a dream of being a marine biologist, and I was that for a long time before I came to Guam. But lots of good opportunities and lots of good conservation work to be done here. I've had funding, because I chose to work with these endangered species, I've also been fortunate to have lots of funding for myself and students through the Center for Island Sustainability, through the College of Natural and Applied Sciences, and other entities. Can I have the next slide, please? I also do a lot of photography, so I'll bother you with some pretty pictures here and there. Next slide. So I'm going to talk first about what are the protected land invertebrates on Guam. There are 3 tree snail species that we need to talk about and 1 butterfly. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the threats to these species. And some of those are man-made, some of those are natural. And what are the challenges in protecting them, and maybe get some discussion on what you folks or what the public can do to help. Next slide, please. So what are tree snails? I just came back from Hawaii, and we spent some time at the Bishop Museum, and the focus in Hawaii is their iconic tree snails that occur on Oahu. Well, we have our own tree snails, and they are primarily from the Western Pacific. They are called pulmonate because they breathe air. In fact, if you put one of these snails in water, they'll drown. So they're truly land animals, okay? We call them arboreal, but the fact is they live on shrubs. Sometimes you'll find them off of trees, and they're also on trees as well. So we find them on land, usually above the ground, and usually on plants. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the tree snails. Next slide. This is probably something most of you don't care about. They're in a scientific family called the partulids. And we find partulids in the Western Pacific. And you can see the map here. Maybe you can see some of the areas. There are 131 recognized species. The good news is we only have to deal with 4 from Guam, but there are 7 known from the Marianas. Next slide. We think that some species can live more than 5 years, although I haven't found that evidence in our snails. And over their lifetime, they can produce more than 90 offspring. And they're a little different from the snails that you have in your aquarium that lay the eggs on the glass. They actually birth their babies live, okay? They're ovoviviparous, that's the term. And they're hermaphrodites. So once they reach a certain size, they're both males and females at the same time. So in some way, they have some resilience in that they don't have to have a partner to reproduce in very small populations. And all species around the Pacific are on the decline because of similar threats. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, there are 7 recognized species in the Marianas, and you can see in yellow the most widespread one, and that's Partula gibba, okay? Also found on Guam. The ones that we need to worry about are the Guam species, which includes Partula gibba, Guam's down here, Partula radiolata, Partula salafana, which is extinct, and I'll talk about that, and then an oddball, this guy down here. Next slide. So these are our tree snails, and the one you're most likely to see is on the right. This is Partula radiolata. Partula gibba is that one that's found on several islands in the Marianas. And then we have Samoana fragilis. They're all listed as endangered species and have federal protection, and I think technically they have local protection as well. They were all listed in, I think, about October 2015. Next slide. So what about traditional references to these snails? That's a good question. My guess is that some of those references may have been lost. There's a term, a Chamorro term, for land snail. It's a general term, and that's akaleha. We don't have a record of traditional use other than some exceptions, recent exceptions I'll show you in a bit. They were first described scientifically in the 1820s by a Frenchman who passed through the region. And the most complete study in the Marianas was done in the 1920s by Crampton. And I had the pleasure of seeing some of the original specimens he collected here at the Bishop Museum in Hawaii when I was there. More recently, Barry Smith had worked with these snails in the 1990s to the early 2000s. Next slide, please. I'll talk first about Partula gibba. This used to be the most widespread and abundant tree snail on Guam. And you can see the typical form here, a little orange tip and creamy white colored body whorl, we call it. Now, we only have these in one place currently, and that's at NICTAM's Naval Telecommunications Station in Findagajan. And there are 3 small clusters at and around Haputo. I can tell you, because I've counted nearly every one of them at some point, that we probably have no more than 200. Next slide. If you see this snail, this is probably what you're going to see, because their shells are fairly common and you'll find them in the leaf litter. But they're old and very weathered. Today, this is what you'll see. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that Partula gibba also occurs in other islands in the Marianas, and they're extinct on Anatahan because it's a volcanic island and it erupted recently. They're nearly gone, or maybe gone from Saipan, and same for Tinian. Sarigan may have the only large population, and that's because there was a big effort to wipe out ungulates and non-native species there. Now, some people think, okay, well, they're on other islands. Why do we need to worry about them on Guam? And one reason is because of genetic diversity. There are genetic differences between populations on different islands. Next slide, please. So this is the tree snail you're most likely to encounter here on Guam. This is Partula radiolata. And it's called radiolata because, well, we'll see on some other pictures, they have these lines that sort of radiate from a point. It's endemic to Guam, so it's only found here. It's not found on any other island anywhere else, okay? It used to be a little less common than Partula gibba in the 20s when Crampton did his study, but now, for some reason, it's the most common and widespread. And in fact, it's much more common than we realized when Fish and Wildlife decided to list this and other species. I think currently we have somewhere around, well, it's more than 70 populations, and you can see the dots all around the island. Some of the populations are pretty large, and because it's much more common than we realized, maybe there's been a bounce back in population, I'm not sure. It's the one that has the most issues with development, okay? But we have to remember it's only found on Guam, so its populations may still be quite at risk. Next slide, please. So here's some of the variations of this snail, and you can see those lines that sort of radiate from the sutures between the different whorls on the shell. And as I mentioned, it's fairly common. This is the one you're most likely to encounter if you see a live tree snail. In fact, I could go outside of this hotel and probably walk 300 meters in 2 different directions and find you some of these. Okay? Next slide, please. This is Partula salafana. I don't have a live shot because they're gone. They're extinct. They went extinct probably in the 50s. And it was originally named because it was discovered on Mount Alifan. So some of you are probably wondering, why is it Salifan? Well, the old Navy maps misspelled Alifan as Salifan. So that's how it's got its name. We found old shells in several different areas in southwest Guam, Mount Alifan, Mount Lam Lam, and some of the peaks and areas in between. It was discovered in the 20s by Crampton, and it was last seen alive in the 1950s. It's got to be extinct. I don't have a picture 3 here, but the shells, the fresh shells, look really, really pretty. I saw some of those at the Bishop Museum. I'm holding out hope we might find some of these in a ravine somewhere that hasn't been affected by fire or other things. But it's interesting that this species went extinct long before many of the other predators and introduced species, invasive species, have affected our snails. Next slide, please. This is a fragile tree snail down here on the right, and here are, I think we've got, it keeps changing, 8 sites that we find them. We only find this on Guam and Rota, and I've been to the Rota site, and there are not many of them left there. So Guam is has our biggest populations. These are usually in small numbers, sometimes only a handful, sometimes in the hundreds, and I think this species may be the most in need of protection and research. When I've done counts of these and compared them over the year, these seem to be affected by some of the introduced predators, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. It's called Salmonella fragilis because, well, the fragilis part, because the shell is nearly transparent. So it's the fragile tree snail. And what you see when you see these variations in color are not the shell, it's the body underneath, which is kind of interesting. But that shell, that thin shell, may also cause other issues. It may make them more vulnerable to other things. And here are some of the sites in those 8 populations. And I think the most recent one we found was around the fuel farm, the Navy fuel farm, actually, in Sasa Valley, which was a big surprise to us. Next slide, please. So, where do we find snails? What do they like? That's a good question. We usually find these snails, all 3 species, in places that have a well-developed canopy. That means overhead vegetation that provides shade, lush understory vegetation, moist soils with leaf litter, often in coastal forests, and sometimes in residential areas along roadsides on introduced plants that I'll refer to as vine towers, and I'll show you some of these in a little bit. Next slide. Oh, by the way, does anybody go back to this slide? Anybody guess where this is? The previous slide. No, you're going backwards. Sorry. Maybe you can't go backwards. No, go. There. Anybody know where this is? Yep, San Carlos. San Carlos, okay. Next slide. Here's another coastal forest. This is around Hilan, around Lost Pond. And next slide. This is one of those vine towers. And there's actually a tree underneath here that's covered by one or more species of vine, invasive vines. Now, the tree snails don't know that the plants they're on are invasive. They like big, fat leaves that provide cover. And you can often find them in some odd areas on the leaves of vines like this. A good example is, I believe it's Aspen Spring. There's a water pump station there, and they haven't done a lot of maintenance. I haven't been there recently, but they hadn't done a lot of maintenance for a long time. So this vine grew all over all the fences, and we knew the snails were in back of where that pump station is. Well, now they have a problem because they need to renovate the station. It's leaking, and there's endangered species all over those vines hanging off the fence. Next slide, please. Here's another example. There's a tree underneath here, and I believe this is Epipremnum or golden pothos. Snails, especially the Guam tree snail, really like those vines. Next slide, please. So they prefer broadleaf plants because broadleaf plants provide a lot of shade and decreased temperature. It keeps them from drying out. usually find them on the undersides of leaves. When it's raining, they're out and about. Sometimes you find them on the ground, sometimes you'll find them on trunks, and they don't care, in many cases, whether something is native or introduced. Not all introduced plant species are good, but some of them are very good for them. Okay, next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's no record of traditional use by Chamorro as food or material items, and I mentioned the name Acaleja. Next slide, please. However, a practice started after World War II where folks were fashioning snail shells into various items like purses, and this is a vest here, and jewelry, and things like that. We don't think that that practice originated here. It may have been something folks did to generate income, but we also don't think that it occurred so much that it is the reason for the decline in our snail species. Next slide, please. So, what's killing our tree snails? There are two main threats. First are introduced predators, which I'll talk about here in a bit. And then the second is habitat degradation and destruction. Next slide. There are natural predators on tree snails: coconut crabs, zuzu, hermit crabs, other land crabs, maybe birds. But we don't have many birds right now, so they aren't a major predator at present. Next slide, please. Non-native predators include rats. I'd say Helitai, but Helitai are now no longer non-native. They're considered native. Pigs, but I've never seen a pig eat a tree snail, so that's a hard one to prove. There have been many things introduced to control a pest snail you guys probably know, the giant African snail. And some of those carnivorous snails had an impact early on our native tree snail species, but they're wiped out, those introduced snails, most of them, okay? The biggest predator is probably the monocory flatworm, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. Ants may also be a problem in some places. Just one thing I want to mention, rats. Rats on Guam are not major predators of tree snails because brown tree snakes seem to limit the number of rats. In the CNMI, rats are still very common. There are no brown tree snakes, cross our fingers. Excuse me. So rats are big predators of tree snails in the Marianas, the other Marianas Islands. Next, please. So here's some evidence of damage you might find on shells. This one, the tip is broken off. This is a compression injury. Maybe it fell from a leaf. And here you can see maybe some crushing, maybe from a crab claw. Next slide, please. Here's our friend, the Manokwari flatworm. The scientific name is Platydemus manokwari. And it was introduced, we think accidentally, into the Marianas somewhere in between the 1970s and the 1980s, although there's a disputing account that they may have shown up a little earlier than that. They're from, I believe, part of Indonesia. It's a voracious predator. The good news is they wiped out the predatory snails that were also a problem for our native tree snails, like the rosy wolf snail you may have heard of. And the problem is that they have impacted our native snails, all of Guam's land snails. Now, we only have 3 protected snail species. Does anybody want to guess how many snails we have that are native to Guam? Try around 100. Close to 100, yep. And nobody's looking at those, and one of the reasons is because they're small, and the other reason is most of them are probably already gone, okay? This is probably the biggest, this Manokwari flatworm is probably the biggest issue. It's present on nearly every Pacific island, and it's a major predator for many things. Public enemy number 1. Next slide, please. Ants. you guys have heard of LFA, little fire ants, or little something ants, you might call them. And we have a lot of introduced ant species. They may occur, I've seen them occur on the same plants and trees as tree snails. They could be a major threat to our tree snails on Guam, but my research has not been very clear on that. I found an area behind Assen Beach Park where we moved snails from the back, the south side to the north side to get them away from little fire ants. It was a big project in 2015. And then I came back there three years later. The ants were still there, and the snails had bounced back from a few individuals that we couldn't get. So it's not clear to me that the ants are always a major problem. But they are a problem for other species in natural habitats. Next slide, please. This is same text, and you can see a snail here and some ants. I don't think the ants killed the snail. I think the ants are finishing the job, maybe feeding on the leftovers from a flatworm. Next slide, please. So, how about habitat destruction? Well, although some tree snails like invasive plant species do have a big impact because they change forest communities and make them less hospitable for everything. Then there's habitat conversion by our two biggest ungulate problems, pigs and deer. Now, if you're a hunter, they're not a problem to you, but unfortunately, they have a big impact both on the vegetation and on the soils in places where tree snails are common. And then human development, which I'll touch on. Next slide, please. Invasive plants, as you know, can outcompete native plants for shade and substrate. They don't always provide the same level of cover as native plants, and they may take up more nutrients from the soils, and in many places our soils are rather thin. Okay? The worst offenders include things like tangan, lemondicina, and a lot of those vines. You've heard of chain of love. That's not a plant that snails particularly like, but the chain of love vine is ubiquitous. You guys have probably seen it somewhere. But as I mentioned, some of those vines, like golden pothos, are favorites of our tree snails. Next slide, please. Feral ungulates, wild pigs. They graze on understory vegetation, including plants that snails occur on. The pigs especially disturb the soils in their natural replenishment. So if you've ever been down to Sedja Bay, down near the bridge, the Spanish Bridge, that's pretty good tree snail habitat, but it's getting worse because pigs are digging it up, and when it's not rainy, the soils don't retain their moisture. And deer in particular higher elevations are guilty of spreading non-native seeds everywhere, which make things worse for everything. These also make habitats more invasive, more vulnerable to invasive plant species. Next slide, please. Human development. Well, in the past, agricultural conversion could have been a big impact on natural habitats, but I'm concerned about, in particular, hotel development, and that's hotel development north of Tumon on the western coast of Guam. These are prime habitats for tree snails and other protected species. There are DoD projects that do impact tree snails, but some of them are set aside for conservation, like Haputo, and the military right now is the only one funding, providing major sources of funding for conservation work for tree snails, with some exceptions. Infrastructure projects, a lot of you don't know that the Marble Cave project is adjacent to a population of Samoana fragilis, and I never got the concerns I had addressed when that project was approved. And in fact, they had to adjust the footprint of that project because snails were found in the construction footprint and not caught by a survey. And then we have unauthorized bush cutting and clearing of land, and not just private lands, but public lands. And this is an issue we deal with a lot. I see bush cutting somewhere, I report it, nothing gets done. Maybe there's some interagency communication issues that need to be resolved. But these are recurring issues. Next slide, please. So how can we save tree snails before I get on to the butterflies? Well, we still need to figure out where they occur. And although I'm getting tired of doing survey after survey, it would be nice to know where all our snails are. We need to establish ungulate-free zones, and I know the NAVFAC is working on that for Haputo, and Air Force is working on that for some of their lands. We need to also do some basic research on the biology of our tree snails. We don't know a lot about how long they specifically live. We only know that from other species that have been worked on elsewhere. We need to learn more about that. Biocontrols for the flatworms, this is something that would be beneficial to many other places, not just Guam. And then captive rearing programs, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we have conservation rules, we have conservation regulations, but we need to actually enforce those rules once in a while, or at least make people aware of them so they don't violate them. And then awareness. Next slide, please. We want to work with zoos on the mainland because they are already rearing other species from other parts of the world that are related to our snails. And one of the challenges has been which snails do we decide are going to be reared in captivity? Do we use one that's been reared before? Do we rear Partula radiolata, the Guam tree snail, which is everywhere and probably doesn't need that much attention? Right now, we have some permitting work with St. Louis Zoo, where they're planning to work with some of our snails from the region, and they're actively trying to get their permits from Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide, please. Go to the next slide. PR. Most of you probably have not seen a tree snail. You've probably not seen this guy unless you were around in the 1970s when they were still making jewelry out of them. To the general public, I have a hard time convincing them why these animals are important. They're not cultural icons. They're not cocoa birds. They're not dolphins. They're easily overlooked, and a lot of people misidentify them as some of the invasive garden pests that you have, like the African snail. So one of the challenges that I have as a biologist is coming up with ways to make them more appealing to the general public. I don't think any of you would be excited about a Guam tree snail marathon or run, because snails don't run. It's not like a cocoa bird, right? Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about our 8-spot butterfly. And this is probably a species that only a few of you in this room have ever seen, okay? It's called the Mariana 8-spot butterfly because if you count the dots around its wings, you can find 8 spots. It's also called the Mariana forest flicker. Excuse me. We abbreviated MESB because it's just easier to say that than Mariana 8-spot butterfly. Its scientific name is Hypolimnus octocula marianensis. And you're probably thinking, why does it have 3 names? Because don't species have 2 names? Well, it's actually a subspecies. And it's a subspecies of Hypolimnus octocula, and one of the other subspecies occurs in Palau. We only find it on Guam. It's also known from Saipan from a couple specimens, but it's probably extinct there. It hasn't been seen for decades. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, it's a subspecies of Hypolimnus octocula. The other subspecies is in Palau, and it was listed along with, excuse me, tree snails and many plants in October 2015. Next slide. Now, if you want to know what a butterfly does and what it needs, you need to figure out what its caterpillars eat. If you guys ever had problems with caterpillars, the butterflies aren't the problem, it's the caterpillars that are eating your plants, okay? But these are not problem butterflies or problem caterpillars. They lay their eggs on two different host plants. One of them is Prochorus pedunculata, we'll just call it Prochorus. And the other one is Elatostema calcareum. And the other one has a Chamorro name. I'm probably going to mispronounce it, Tupun adzuzu. And I'm not an expert on Chamorro, but it could mean coconut crab salad or coconut crab greens. Supposedly, coconut crabs eat this. But that plant is also something that's used by traditional medicine as well. The caterpillars only eat these host plants. They don't eat anything else. So if we want to figure out where they are, we have to figure out where their host plants occur. Next slide, please. They attach their chrysalids, which is a fancy way of saying cocoon for butterflies, to their host plants or sometimes in other areas nearby. We've never seen the adults feed on anything, but if you know butterflies, they're feeding on nectar on flowers. And we're starting some captive rearing work with these butterflies, and that's a big challenge. We have to figure out a food that we can provide in captivity for the adults. Next slide, please. There was an unpublished study in the 1990s by a pair of faculty at the University of Guam who retired a while ago. And their eggs last about 6 days. Their caterpillar stages, they're 3 to 4 days each. So if you calculate that, it's just a little under a month. The cocoon or chrysalid stage is about a week. So they rely on those host plants for around a month. They need a month time to live on those host plants. We don't know how long the adults live. Have no idea. Next slide, please. Here's some eggs, and you notice they're different colors. These are green, these are freshly laid. Most of these are black, maybe a few of them are translucent with black inside. These are no more than 1.5 millimeters in diameter, so pretty small, okay? The ones that are black are probably not viable. They're probably ones that are infected by a parasitoid wasp, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Next slide, please. Larvae, this is what they look like when they first hatch out. Here's a transparent egg case. Here's a little larvae that is just chewing its way out of, or caterpillar chewing its way out of its egg case, and here's a newly emerged caterpillar here. This is about maybe 3-4 millimeters in length. Next slide, please. This is about a week old. They start to get darker and more spikes. Next slide, please. And when they get bigger, you start to see evidence on plants that they occur. And that evidence is these little black dots. And the technical term for caterpillar poop is frass, F-R-A-S-S. So you've got a vocabulary word now. Next slide, please. Just before they pupate, this is what they look like. They've got rows of red spikes along their brown body, and their face cap is black, okay? Next slide, please. And this is what their poop looks like. Next slide. Chrysalids look a little bit like this, and sometimes we find them on their host plants, sometimes we find them in forest trees or bushes nearby, sometimes hanging off a rock. One of the challenges is that their chrysalids look identical to two related species that occur in the region. So sometimes we don't know 100% if a chrysalid is an 8-spot chrysalid or not. Next slide. Here's what the adults look like. And I have been working with these guys for about 8 years, and probably only 2 or 3 times have I ever gotten a shot like this, where the wings are open. Because usually what I see is this or this, where the wings are closed. And that's not as pretty as this. So you can't see the full beauty of them until they open their wings like that. My graduate student is much better at catching these, and he lords it over me when he whips out his Samsung phone and says, "See what I got with my phone that you couldn't get with your $2,000 camera?" Next slide, please. And here's a couple mating. This is another shot my graduate student get that I didn't get. We've never seen that, but we still can't figure out quite who's the male and the female. That's a challenge for us when we're doing captive rearing. And sometimes they'll land on your head if you're out in the limestone forest where they occur. We think that they're going for sweat. So have a sweaty head if you want to see an 8-spot. Next slide, please. So the butterflies are limited to places where the caterpillars are. And the caterpillars live on eat these host plants. They have to eat them. They eat a lot of them. And the host plants only grow in nature in limestone forests on limestone karst. The plants grow in little packets of soil in the cracks of limestone, okay? Many of these places are difficult to reach. Many occur in coastal forests with karst. So some of the best places are the forests along Tangisen, close to the cliffs, and along the path and ridges around Helan and Lost Pond. But we also find them in very difficult habitats up on top of the cliffs. Much of Northwest Field is habitat or was habitat like this. Next slide, please. So some of the hurdles for 8 spots. Pig don't have a good time getting the host plants. They have a harder time getting them. But deer are really good at them. So in some places, grazing by deer is a big problem. Parasitoids, which I'll talk about a little bit, that attack the eggs and chrysalids. And then we have introduced predators. And then we have some problems. There are weaknesses for these poor butterflies themselves. And then we also have to talk a little bit about habitat degradation. Next slide, please. So here's a hermit crab chewing on host plants, and crabs, for some reason, like to chew on them, but I can't imagine that they're major predators everywhere. Ungulates, as I mentioned, deer like to graze on them in some places, not all places. Like low places like around Helan and Lost Pond, deer don't seem to be major grazers there. But in the upper karst areas around Northwest Field, deer do have a big impact. Next slide, please. This is a Cuban slug. You probably heard of them. Okay. Cuban slugs are in your garden, and they also eat host plant. And you can tell when a Cuban slug is eating host plant because the damaged areas have smooth edges, whereas if an 8-spot caterpillar like this eats them, it tends to be jagged. Some people think that these are major predators of host plants. I think that that's overstated. Next slide, please. There are at least 2 tiny parasitoid wasps that attack 8-spot butterfly eggs, okay? And I'm going to try to show you one here. So first off, parasitized eggs turn black. The non-parasitized eggs stay green until they're ready to hatch. And right here, this is an egg, and that egg was laid right just before I took this photo. And as I was taking that photo, this little black bugger here, which is a tiny wasp, came up to that egg and stuck its ovipositor in it and laid its own egg in there, okay? This is a parasitoid, a tiny parasitoid wasp, and there are at least 2 species. They lay their egg in that egg eats the butterfly egg, and there's no caterpillar. No caterpillar can hatch out. The parasitism rates for our 8-spot eggs is 90% and higher. So one of the challenges we're having when we're collecting eggs back to bring back into the lab to rear is almost all of them are parasitized. Next slide, please. Now we found another problem, or I should say a Fish and Wildlife employee at Retidian found another problem. A larger wasp, which is this little orange guy here, about the size of your thumbnail, attacks the chrysalids. And once the chrysalid is made, this is one of those surviving caterpillars that has made its own cocoon, they inject their own egg into the chrysalid, their larvae eat the developing chrysalid, and you don't get a butterfly. Next slide, please. Ants are thought to be egg predators, but we don't have a lot of observations. One of the related species of butterflies guards its eggs and keeps ants away, but it lays its eggs in a huge sheet. We're also worried about those mud wasps or mud daubers you may know about that make those nasty brown muddy nests on the side of your house or sometimes on your car. We think that mud wasps may also take 8-spot caterpillars to their nests, but we don't have any direct observations. Next slide. One of the problems is the life history limitations, the biological limitations of this species. I mentioned the related species, it lays a sheet of 100. These guys only lay a few eggs at a time, but probably on many plants. I generally see no more than 1 to 5 on host plants. And here you can see a butterfly. In fact, that butterfly that laid the egg that was attacked by the parasitoid, depositing an egg right here on the underside of a leaf. As I mentioned, this is the related hypolimnus, and you can see the sheet of eggs it protects. The 8 spots don't protect their eggs. They just lay their eggs and go somewhere else. So a different strategy. That might work out well when there are no parasitoids or ants, but it may not be a good strategy in the current day. Okay? Next slide, please. Habitat degradation is another issue. As I mentioned, the caterpillars have to lay, the adults have to lay their eggs on the host plants. The caterpillars have to live at least for a month eating the host plants. So reproduction and propagation is totally dependent on the host plants. Both those host plant species, as I mentioned, are limited to limestone forests, and in some of the same places in many cases where we find tree snails. Sometimes these are really harsh places that are hard to get to, but sometimes these are the top of cliff lines, such as, for example, next to Two Lovers Point, okay, where people want to build hotels and nice promontory buildings and so on and so forth. These habitats are in decline around the island. Next slide, please. So here's a map that shows in gray, different colors of gray, most of the karst around Guam. And as most of you know, we don't have as much karst, much limestone in the south. It's mostly in the north. That doesn't mean we don't have any, but we just have less. And this band of limestone around the northern part of Guam just happens to be where we find a lot of the populations you might be able to see in red of 8-spot butterflies. Next slide, please. So, there are a lot of things that we don't know about these butterflies. So one of the reasons we're doing captive rearing is to get a better idea. We have no idea how many adults there are because they're so spread out. We don't know if they have a reproductive period. One study that was done near the university suggested they peak in February, but that was done in 1 year. And I can tell you right now, the study that we're doing at Anderson Air Force Base suggests that their reproductive periods are at other times, okay? We're very concerned about decreasing the connectivity between those limestone karst features around the northern edge of Guam, because that may decrease the connectivity between populations and may make it harder for adults to disperse to areas maybe that have fewer parasitoids. We also don't know much about host plant distribution and permanence. Permanence meaning how long they occur. There are some places I've been to at Northwest Field to look for butterflies and then come back to move plants and found that in some cases host plants have totally disappeared from an area and popped up in other areas. So they may not be persistent in all places. So if we're going to conserve these species and others, we need to figure out some of these knowledge gaps. We need to fill them in. Next slide, please. So what we're doing to help 8-spot butterflies right now is, well, we're currently doing a study of 3 populations, or I should say 3 host plant clusters at various spots at Anderson Air Force Base, had some interesting results. We started captive rearing trials at UOG, and our goal is to get adults to lay eggs. and we're continuing to map host plant sites around the island. We do have some sites in the south, just not as many. Next slide, please. Both tree snails and eight-spot butterflies have a PR problem. They're not what I not so jokingly refer to as charismatic megafauna. Megafauna means big animal, or large enough that you can see it, I guess. And they're not cocoa birds. They're not, as I mentioned, dolphins. They're not fanihi. They're not warm and fuzzy. The other problem is particularly tree snails and the butterflies to some extent can be confused with non-native things and non-listed species, including some pests. So the general public is not aware of what our native fauna is in many cases. And the other issue is that we don't have good enforcement of endangered species laws and regulations on Guam, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So I think you can all agree cocoa birds and fanihi are cuddly. Maybe you think these are delicious and not cuddly. Next slide. Green sea turtles, it's another protected species. Slevin skink, which is another endangered species, but only found on Cocos. Kind of cuddly. What do you think, more or less cuddly than a snail? Some of you don't want to say. Less. All right. Next slide, please. Here's a newly born Samoana fragilis. Has a little bit of the calcified shell you sometimes find on that species. And here's a Mariana's eight-spot butterfly. Do you guys think these are cuddly? Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Here is a slide of 5 different snails you can find on Guam. Which one of them is native? And you guys who work at DWR, be quiet. What?
Top right. Top right.
Yo, you know too. Only one of these is native, and this is the Guam tree snail. Edwin was right. I should have said Edwin too. This is the giant African snail, which gets the size of your hand. This is a lion snail, which a lot of people confuse with these guys because they're around the same size. This is a snail called the Mexican amber snail, and it's not super common, but it's considered invasive in other parts of the U.S. It's a papaya pest. And then here is a snail I call the cinnamon bun snail, which is kind of a pest. By the way, you don't want to handle any land snails because there are some nematode parasites that are known to affect people. So don't handle them. If you do, wash your hands. Don't eat them, okay? Unless you cook them, and you probably shouldn't eat them anyway. Next slide. So the only native one is this one. So some ideas. Start a nonprofit conservation foundation, Save Our Snails. SOB, Save Our Butterflies. I don't think SOB will work, though. Okay? Court media coverage. I'm not real charismatic myself, so this is not something I'm really good at. Some of my students, you know, let's do an Instagram page and all that. Maybe that's one of the ways to go. Maybe we should work with GVB to come up with an Akaleha mascot. Yeah. Akaleha run. No. Okay. Videos. We certainly have the gear to do videos. I just don't have the talent. I'm open to suggestions because PR is something that's not my specialty. Next slide. And I ask everybody, is this what you want to find when you want to look for native snails? A handful of old, dingy shells you find in the dust? Or do you want to find, next slide, please? Something like this. Okay? And folks like me can study these snails all we want, but it takes the public's engagement and willingness to work with or appreciate endangered species and support their conservation. Next slide, please. What you guys can do is work for policies to minimize habitat destruction and ensure when there is development, it has a small footprint. Actively engage, those of you who are working with agencies or construction firms, actively engage with DAR and Fish and Wildlife or Department of Agriculture before doing any major bush cutting or clearing that could impact tree snails and butterflies? If you don't know they're there, ask. And be informed and be advocates for conservation. And since this is a planning conference, plan responsibly. Make sure that you have a conservation plan for any project, and be flexible so that you can adjust that project. Next slide, please. A lot of people who helped me with the snail work, we call our group Snail Team 6. And you can see some of the names up here. And we have a lot of funding from different agencies, federal and local agencies. Next slide, please. And the butterfly folks, Aubrey Moore is my co-PI for most of our butterfly work at the University of Guam. We have funding from Fish and Wildlife and DAR, Air Force, Navy, they've all been giving us funding. My field team for both butterflies and snails works for the Center of Island Sustainability, and you guys have met Else probably, and some of our other employees. We also collaborate with the Guam National Wildlife Refuge at Rutidian, and we have collaborators at the University of Hawaii as well. Next slide, please. So, thank you for listening, and if we have a little bit of time, we'll open up for questions.
How about a round of applause for Dr. Fiedler?
Yes?
Threshold do these things become unendangered? I mean, at what point do we say, oh, there's enough of them, they're not endangered anymore? What's the threshold for that level?
I can't answer that question because that's a Fish and Wildlife question.
Well, that's we got a big problem.
I've asked them because Partula radiolata is super common, and it's encountered a lot in construction and other activities, and it's more common than we realized. So do we downlist it? I've asked them if they want to do that, and the comment is that it's hard to relist something if you downlist it. We also have to remember that the Guam tree snail is only found on Guam, so there should be some level of protection for it. But I can't tell you what that level is because that's a legal, that's a regulatory definition. Now, do I have a biological opinion? I do, but I'm not sure I want to say what that is at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Bora, for that
Good question.
And so we are out of time, so I just want to thank Dr. Fiedler for your presentation. I certainly learned more and have a greater appreciation.
One comment, if you guys want a guide to the local snails, we do have a PDF, and Fish and Wildlife printed up a bunch of them. So if you send me an email, I'll get you a PDF so that you can have an idea of what our native and non-native snails are.